Hello and welcome back to Analysing Avatar. Dan,
we're
here,
back,
as always,
baby.
Joined by Chris. We're very excited to be here. It's been a long time, Chris. I don't know the exact date of the last episode, but it was quite a while back. And I will say this now: you know, a lot's changed for both of us, Chris. Since what was it, May? Yeah, it was May. It was the end of May. Chris now has 3 children. And a different wife. 3 different wives.
Quickly.
I own a successful hot dog stand now, and I'm retiring from the podcast game. I'm a hot dog mogul, really. I own a chain of hot dog stands, actually, now. It's so successful. So a lot's gone on.
That would be more funny were it not for the uncomfortable truth that you could potentially make more money selling hot dogs than you do from this podcast.
What do you mean, could? I would definitely make more money selling hot dogs than I do from this podcast. That's not even a question, Chris. There's no debate. Thanks everyone for coming back. We know it was an extended break. I think it was needed, if I'm being honest. I don't think we could have jumped straight into Korra, 11 weeks after finishing Avatar. It was such a big epic journey.
The 31st of May of 2022 is when we last did this. I've just double checked.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, 31st. There you go. So it was right at the end of May. So then we had a couple of weeks off, and then we literally did like 3 seasons of Rewind reviews back to back. And here we are, February 2023. It's been a long time. But, at least we won't be anywhere, close to being refreshed because we're still doing podcasts the entire time.
Yeah, and I mean, for those that listened to the Harry Potter and the Rewind Reviews podcast, I think you'll know how damaging to our mental health that actually was. So we're all refreshed and dandy, and you're probably thinking, well, I imagine though what Chris and Dan have done is, they've put themselves in a place where they've started this podcast when they're actually feeling a little bit refreshed. No. For context, people, we're recording this on the 23rd of December. Like, we are smack bang in the middle of Christmas and work and all sorts. But Dan,
and my alarm definitely didn't go off at bloody 7:15 a.m. this morning to make sure I was up for this and awake by the time we were recording. I'm definitely not on my second cup of tea already.
I've started to, where I've had a bit of a cold, I've started to make more tea at home. I used to, why are we talking about this? But anyway, I eat tea if I'm in the office, drink tea, if I'm in the office. I rarely just make myself a cup of tea, and it's not much effort, Dan, and I've started to do it more.
No, I think it is a good thing to do. I do like a cup of tea. I don't know if I said it, but we're here for Korra. Because I did the intro kind of wrong, didn't I? Because it's supposed to be Analysing Avatar. This week we're sitting down to review Welcome to Republic City, the first episode, Chris, of Book 1 of Korra. So, most important thing to start with is apparently I do a recap, which I'd forgotten that was a thing we did, and I had to check how we start and end this podcast before we sit down to record. So
recap away, baby.
Yeah, so this is Welcome to Republic City. This is the episode in which Korra is the Avatar. Deal with it. In the years since Avatar Aang has saved the world, he developed Republic City in the old Fire Nation colonies, which did not want to return to Earth Kingdom rule. Which will be an interesting topic we potentially to tackle as we go in, because obviously there's a real world connotation there, but we'll come back to that. So instead, it was built Republic City, a big, sprawling New York-ish city, New York-esque city, where Tenzin, one of Avatar Aang's children, now lives, and he is tasked with training the new Avatar Korra how to airbend. So it's the element she hasn't mastered yet. At first, he was going to come visit her, where she's been sort of safely kept away from the world while she's trained to be an Avatar, which feels very, very much against the spirit of the way the Avatar should learn. But that's, I think, intentional. I don't think that's an accident that they did it that way. And now a slightly naive Korra has had to travel to Republic City instead to learn airbending and become a bit more worldly. And that's kind of where the first episode leaves us off. as well as introducing a villainous figure in a mask called Ammon. So there you go. Very mysterious and very villainous. And, Korra goes into the city, blunders in head first, and makes a bunch of mistakes really early. And discovers the city is pretty broken, actually. I forgot about that part. Yeah, city fundamentally quite broken. So there's a lot of work to be done. So yeah, that's Welcome to Republic City. I'm really excited to talk to you about this, Chris, because obviously you went into this with less information than maybe anyone who's ever got into this, because by the time this show was announced, love of Avatar, interest and excitement for Avatar was fever pitch, right? So they announced this show, and straight away all anyone wants to know is when is it set, who is it about, what's the context. So, Bri and Mikey, or whatever we used to call them.
I think it was Bri and Mikey.
Bri and Mikey. I think it's Michael DiMartino and Brian something. I've not got it in front of me. Brian Kinitsko. So there you go. But yeah, Mikey and Bri had to sort of talk about it. They couldn't not, right? They had to sort of promote the show with the premise a little bit. And no one went into this show not knowing what it was about. That it was set 70-ish years after Avatar Aang's defeat of the Fire Nation, or the Fire Lord specifically, and that he had passed on, and that it was his successor, Korra, and that the world had moved on quite a bit. In fact, that image of Korra on like the rock on top of Naga looking at the city and the big bridge and the airships was probably one of the first things they released of this show. So we all went into it kind of knowing what this was. But you didn't.
No, I didn't even, and we didn't discuss this, but I didn't even hunt out a trailer.
Right,
like,
which I think is good.
And that's not particularly conscious. That's just me sort of leaving it till the morning to watch the episode and not sort of thinking about it otherwise.
Right.
So yeah, I literally knew nothing at all. And truly, the ideal way to go into this, if I'm honest, because, like, maybe I'm an idiot, Dan, but I'd have predicted and expected, I'd have been like, well, presumably in the first episode, Korra finds a gang, and they go off and start having their own adventures, and there's a bad guy with a vendetta. Like, I'd have literally been like, that's probably going to be the same premise, isn't it? Like, that's what I do. Avatar worked. Let's just do it again a few years later. The notion of right, the world's moved on to a point where it's almost, to some degree, feels more modern than Avatar did. The notion of, nope, it isn't necessarily, at least at this point, and I'm sure it will become, but it's not necessarily Korra and the gang. It's, Korra and her master, and maybe the master's family. Just all of that. And just the notion of Republic City, like visually, like you say, her on the rock looking at like a city, like visually, it's just so different and intriguing and exciting, and the politics of it, of the world and all of that sort of stuff, I think is really interesting. So I think this is a great, unique, fresh sequel that does feel like an Avatar show. We've got bending. We've got Katara, for goodness sake, in this first episode. Like, it categorically feels like an Avatar sequel, but also very much feels like its own thing in its own show. And I think that's I've only seen episode 1, but based on this first episode, I think that's a huge achievement. And I was really taken aback by the uniqueness of it. And I think it's a shame, in a way, that some of that uniqueness was, spoiled for other people. And would have been for me, presumably, if I'd have watched a trailer or seen some images. But literally just, I don't know, I think, Avatar was so much fun, and we sort of stopped Avatar and went head first. Whilst Dan has said, we've been on a break. We haven't been on a break at all. We literally went straight into rewind reviews. Those podcasts are always slightly more, and I'm aware, like, Tiny Violin, we are still talking about two people sitting on their ass talking about movies, but it's you have to watch the movie. Their longer podcast, Dan has to do an awful lot of work with the trivia. Like, we went straight into that, and I guess I just sort of parked Avatar. And this morning I did also get up early enough to rewatch a recap of Avatar. Just in case, But I just didn't think, it just wasn't in my mind to look at the trailer or do any research about the show. And actually, I love that I didn't, because I think this episode absolutely plays best if you discover that along with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that is really the premise of this first episode, isn't it? It is. When you think of the story of this first episode, it's just Korra goes to Republic City, gets into some bother. It's not very complex, this first episode, plot-wise.
Even at the end, where they're clearly cutting to a villain, you see that on the radio, and you see, like, that shady music, sorry. I literally, in my head, went, oh, yeah, presumably that's a villain. The villain presumably isn't politics. Like, there's got to be an actual villain.
The real villain, politics.
They were like, well, it worked for the Star Wars prequels, let's give it a go. But I was so taken. I was like, oh yeah, we haven't set up a bad guy. And I was fine with that. I really was, because it felt so different. Naively, because I've got to give the creators for this show more credit. Obviously, I've watched Avatar, but I naively just assumed it would be the same thing. So I was really blown away that it wasn't.
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest things that's impressive about this. I think, first of all, committing the first episode to just being discovery of the world and where the world has gone, and acknowledging that people are going to want to know that. And that's what's great as well. We're just seeing Republic City. That's the thing, is we don't know how the rest of the world has moved on. Avatar's a big old world. What's happening in the Earth Kingdom? What are the developments in the water tribes? What's happening out, out everywhere? How has the Fire Nation progressed? And this show will give us a chance, hopefully, as it goes on. I will tell you now, this first season is very Republic City focused. But we do get to step out into other parts of the world as the show goes on. And see how they've gone on. But I credit the creators for doing two very smart things here. One, making it a different show to Avatar and being bold enough to go, no, we're not just going to do that again. I know you liked that, but we'll do something different this time. And I think that was always destined to make this show sit firmly in Avatar's shadow, because I think a lot of people like this show less. And I do think this show is more flawed than Avatar, but I think this show takes bigger swings than Avatar, than the first Avatar, The Last Airbender. Because this is also called Avatar Legend of Korra, so I need to make sure I don't keep pretending like this one isn't called Avatar also. So, genuinely, I think, looking at this, I really respect the choice to do something different, and the choice to commit the first episode to just go, look, everyone's just going to want to know where the world's up to. If we try to introduce any other characters, like set up Korra, giving Korra a gang of a sort, or setting up the villain with spending too much time on whoever the new villain is, or whatever the new situation is, whatever that is, people are just going to be wanting to know more about the city and the place and what's moved on and who's still alive and who's where and what's why. The choice to do it the way they've done it here is really bold from a structure perspective, this first episode. And I don't remember if this first episode aired with its second. Let me check that, actually, because that actually would make, I suppose, a big difference. So this next episode is called A Leaf in the Wind. Did it air the same day? March 24th. So this one aired... Okay, fair enough. So they did release these two together, this one and the next one. But it still feels like a very bold choice to me to do it that way, structurally speaking. But I think it's exactly the right move. And you got to experience that discovery all on your own, just through without having anything spoiled ahead of time.
Yeah, it was amazing. And it is, and I think someone could, because I imagine the shame of it is, I think if you knew a lot of that stuff going in, I mean, it's obviously different because both aired at once, but someone could watch this episode if they knew all that setup, because it is a lot of setup. It's a setup, and then the battle in sort of when she arrives at Republic City. Mm-hmm. Fundamentally, that's what the episode is. And I could understand, and especially, the revelation that, that Aang, although this is something they would have known, the revelation that Aang has passed, the revelation that seemingly, Toph's daughter at the very least has shades or is butting heads with Aang's son, I can imagine someone watching this and going, well, there wasn't much action and there were things in it that I didn't like. I could imagine someone not wanting to see a kind of modern city in Avatar. So I can imagine that if people knew more about this going in, you could come away from this slightly disappointed. You could come away from it going, I don't really want that from an Avatar show, and I don't want to think of Aang and Toph's children butting heads, and I don't want to think of Aang being dead and seemingly Sokka as well, or at least he's either dead or
can't say Sokka after all this time.
Sokka, sorry. Seemingly Sokka as well, who's either dead or estranged, which isn't ideal either way. So, I could see if some of that discovery of what the show has already been spoiled, I can see some people watching this first episode and not enjoying it. That wasn't my experience, but I understand. I think that's understandable.
It's understandable. It's not a criticism I agree with, because I think it's based in your knowledge of it's based in your love of Avatar, The Last Airbender. Not really a critique of this show as a piece of media on its own, standing on its own two legs. There are criticisms to be aimed at this show. As we go, we'll get to them, and I don't think this show is perfect. But when I hear people talk about the show with a really negative tone, sometimes it is with, this villain thing didn't quite work for me, or this thing didn't function, and I go, that's fair enough. Or sometimes it's just basically its biggest crime is not being Last Airbender, which, to not be as good as one of the greatest animated shows of all time, I think that's fine. I think you're allowed to not be as good as one of the greatest animated shows of all time, because who could pull off that trick twice? Do you know what I mean? And in terms of the city, and this is something that we're going to come back to as the show goes on in general, I think. It'll be something we'll be talking about quite regularly, I suspect. But just as a little setup, I encourage our listeners, not you, Chris, because there's spoilers ahead if you do this, but I'd encourage our listeners to find an article online, or I think it's on medium.com, and it's The Inescapable Whiteness of Avatar The Legend of Korra, and its uncomfortable implications. Now, I don't 100% agree with everything said in this article, but there are some really interesting points made about this. And the core of it, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting the author, who's Janet Ng. So do look up the article, read it for yourselves, listeners. I encourage that. But I think one of the core concerns is the idea that progress is presented in this show as westernization. Now, I think there's a truth to that for Republic City, because Republic City is clearly modelled on early New York. I don't think we can escape that. There is an industrial revolution happening. Oh, there's a storm happening outside for me, Chris. A big clap of thunder as I said that. I don't know if that. Yeah, it was pouring down when I woke up this morning. It's calmed down a little bit, but yeah. Well, Nadia's popped out to the shops. I hope she's all right. She was like, "Oh, it's raining, but that'll be all right." I'm like, "Yeah, it's fine." But that was a big old clap of thunder. Anyway, I'm sure she'll be fine. So that I think there is this implication that for a thing to progress, it has to become westernized, and there is a lot of the sort of Asian influence missing from Republic City. But I think the rest of the show still has that stuff, and the rest of the world still has that stuff. Just because this series is set in Republic City, which has gone a bit that way, doesn't necessarily make it, problematic in the way that it's been described in this. But at the same time, I do think there's some truth to that. So as the show goes on, I'll keep an eye on it. I think that's an interesting point. Because also, obviously, an industrial revolution has happened. But, I mean, I guess one of the bigger issues is that in the real world, the situation that the Republic City is the situation. You could draw a parallel to Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong returned to China, but culturally has a lot of Great Britain in it. And that's been a struggle for them. They've not necessarily wanted to let go of their own cultural identity, which is a mixture of those two nations. And the Chinese government have not necessarily been fond of that, right? It's been a messy situation. And you got Republic City, which was a Fire Nation, so it was Earth Nation, taken over by the Fire Nation, so it was a Fire Nation colony during the invasion. Then after the war, simply didn't want to return to the Earth Nation. Didn't want to be Fire Nation either, but didn't want to be Earth Nation, and was kind of its own, wanted to embrace its own culture. Now, the fact that kind of became New York is strange, because you would argue what it should be is a combination of its previous states. But, and there's another but, there were many Fire Nation colonies, and Republic City is one city amongst them that Aang specifically chose to be a sort of neutral place in that it didn't represent any one of the nations in the world of Avatar. So maybe that led to a sort of more homogenized sort of city that's maybe the point is that they're suggesting that the American city lacks culture and lacks its own identity, and that's why it's ended up the way it is. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure what they're trying to imply with that. It looks incredible, and I do think it's an interesting setting for the show, not everything in the show needs to be Asian inspired. I think that's, I think that it's allowed that they've made a city inside the world of Avatar that kind of resembles New York during the Industrial Revolution. So, I don't know. There's a lot to talk about in that area, and I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion rather than something we can tackle today. But I'm assuming, Chris, having just sort of watched 20 minutes of this show, that stuff, I mean, I wouldn't blame you. None of it occurred to me either. I'm assuming that none of that really sort of was coming up while you were watching, but how do you feel having heard that? Like, how much do you think that kind of, how much does that make sense to you, having sort of heard my bad summary of it?
Yeah, no, I none of it necessarily came up while I was watching it, for sure. And I think, because for me it was more, in context of the show, I suppose. So it was more, okay, those early scenes set in the kind of water tribe areas felt like the world of Avatar. The later scenes feel like, a new world that has formed since, and will be a setting for Korra. So it was more a comparison on that front, whilst, as you say, watching a 23-minute episode for the first time. Yes. I didn't kind of take the steps. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I think there is, my instinct would be, and I don't know enough, about Hong Kong or anything to comment on the real world side of it, but my instinct would be that logic of in this world, the different tribes coming together, it would form deliberately a more mutual environment. The point they make when they're setting up the show is, my father and here we go, people. My father and Zuko.
Hey, you go.
Right? Zuko, yeah. The point of it at the beginning is, my father and Zuko made it a republic, made it everyone. They neutralized everything, and I think having a city, maybe it's that it has that feel because it's so close to New York visually, but as you say, it feels like New York in the Industrial Revolution. So that also makes sense. I think it tracks. How much it's lost other influences I can't necessarily comment on yet on the basis of this episode. I would like to think I would like to think that other adventures in other part of this world would show those influences, and I sort of think that the evidence is potentially there for that in this episode, based on the fact that our starting point and starting scenes do that and are that. So yeah, that's a very uninformed take on a subject matter that, as you say, I think will make for a fascinating ongoing discussion.
Yeah, and look, I mean, who are we, like, straight white guys from Britain? Like, who are we to know for sure if that's the case? But it is a really interesting point, and I did really enjoy reading Jeanette Ng's piece. I think it's really fascinating, and it looks at stuff from later seasons as well. And I do think there's truth to it. I don't think it's it is inescapable that this is sort of potentially implying that progress is westernization, and that's good. Yeah. But at the same time, I would also point out that this episode very much demonstrates Republic City is a deeply broken place. So, I'm not sure this show is suggesting westernization is a good thing either. Again, it's just something to keep an eye on, I think, as we go. I don't want to make it like a huge topic of every episode, but I wouldn't mind coming back to this every now and then if there's relevant stuff to it. I think it's the Hong Kong situation particularly is an interesting angle on this because from memory, Chris, and it's been a little while since I've seen this show, certainly longer than since I've seen Airbender. I am not 100% sure how much depth they go into about the wider political implications of the colonies. It's like 70 years have gone by, and it's been enough time for that. There's no real ill will in Republic City specifically for the Earth Kingdom or the Fire Nation. It's just sort of developed its own path. Which is fine and nice. Well, but
yeah,
I think
what's specific? Sorry to interrupt, but it's to add to that it's specifically called out in this bending as a whole, not a specific type of bending, but bending as a whole.
Yes, yeah, which we'll get to in a second. The very last thing I want to add on that topic is I think with the Hong Kong situation, the comparison is that there are people in Hong Kong who have who feel like they've got a shared culture between two places, and they're trying to right now. They're fighting to protect their unique culture from their two very unusual parents, if that makes sense. It's an odd combination of countries to have culture based on. And there's arguably potentially cultural clashes there as a result of it, and it's just really interesting to see that play out. And I think. That's even though there is a parallel to the Hong Kong situation in Korra with Republic City, they don't really look at it from that angle, which is the angle that it's mostly observed through in the real world. So I think that's very interesting, the politics of Republic City are there, but they're different. So while there is a parallel, they don't explore it. It's not having the same issues basically that are happening within Hong Kong, which is again in a similar situation. So yeah, really interesting stuff. Let's talk about the anti-bending stuff. So when Korra gets, if anyone doesn't remember, when Korra gets to Republic City, one of the first things she comes across is like a protester saying that that Benders have all their cool powers and they're just oppressing the regular folk and, exerting their will on them and stuff. How did you feel about that whole scene and what that implies and maybe what that suggests where we're going for the rest of this season?
I thought it was, again, just a really unique, fascinating take that I wasn't necessarily expecting. Mm-hmm. Bending is so celebrated in Avatar. I think it makes sense. They do enough to, you want to delve deeper into it. But you understand how they got there, I think, and it's kind of very linked into our last topic, I suppose. But I thought it was really interesting, and I wasn't. I guess I was slightly taken aback, but the clever thing about that is they're putting the audience in Korra's shoes. Korra is looking to master all three of these skills, and feels the feels the legacy of being the Avatar. Not necessarily connected with the spiritual side of it, which I think is also another fascinating angle. And I think by having those moments, having that scene, it's a really clever way to create a connection with Korra, because you're putting the audience in the same vantage point as her. That feeling I got of, but bending saved the world is what she's feeling, which I think is quite a clever decision. And they don't, because so much of it is set
Well, you could
up,
also argue
which is
bending ruined the world. That's, I think, what's so clever about it.
Yeah. Caused all the problems in the first place.
Right.
Because I don't think because so much of this episode is.
I just absolutely kicked the table, so I was repositioning and my foot collided with the table. Sorry if the listeners heard that on the microphone.
Because I don't think there's so much of this episode is set up. I don't think we really delve into any character, and I would include Korra within that. I'm glad we didn't spend too long with her in her really young, I'm the Avatar state, because, that was a bit early Aang annoying. But
I did want to ask you about I'm the Avatar, deal with it, because some people have not liked her immediate mastery, it seemed, of all the elements but one. At a very young age.
I think that's fine, because she's the first Avatar to grow up in a world where the different bendings aren't cordoned off. She's had exposure to all of them her entire life, which no other Avatar, well, apart from maybe the early ones, but, compared to the Avatar we've seen learn, Aang, who's been frozen, is in a completely different world and has come out to find, didn't necessarily grow up with access to all forms of bending.
Interesting. That's a really interesting theory, because I always took it as that they were implying she's just very gifted and could immediately connect to all of them, except for airbending, which we'll obviously be coming to as the season progresses. This one is called Air for a reason. It's she's in the opposite position to Aang. Aang started knowing airbending and nothing else and learning the others. She started knowing all the others and only having really air left to master. That's a fascinating take on it, actually. I'd never thought of that, because I always thought the implication was just she was some sort of like weird sort of partial prodigy, that she just immediately grasped the other three and was just going to struggle with that one. But your idea that, like, she's grown up in a world where arguably the different nations are a bit more mixed in. 70 years of Aang, sort of having been a successful Avatar in terms of, defeating the Fire Nation, has led to a more unified world, and therefore she's had more exposure to bending forms other than her own from an early age, is a really interesting take. Because obviously where we see her, she's very much in a water tribe village with water tribe clothes, and it's all very water tribe. But you're right. Maybe just down the road there's a family of earthbenders that have moved in, or it's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of that, but yes,
because and you could absolutely poke holes in that, like you say. The biggest one being, well, she appears to be very much water tribe, but I think she's aware of Republic City and all that stuff, and I think the difficulty with, well, she's just naturally gifted and instinctive on this stuff. I think the difficulty with that is, it slightly clashes with them setting up that she's not very spiritual and isn't connected to the spiritual side of things.
Right.
And it would feel like any instinctive influence of that is going to come from the spiritual side, which she isn't connected to particularly. So, yeah, I think it's interesting, but it didn't bother me. But again, my first reaction was well, fucking hell, we're not doing this again, are we? So, I wasn't necessarily thinking about the nuances of it all. I think
you weren't thinking of the practicalities of how she suddenly can do all the bending. You were thinking,
no.
Oh God, I hope she's not going to be this annoying the whole time.
Yeah, completely. And absolutely, that's what was going on in my head. And also, I think sometimes with any show or any, piece of media which has a fundamental premise or version of the One, or, powers that come from an unknown force, people get way too... I'm talking about Rey here in Star Wars. People get way too picky on, how are they that skilled? The fucking premise is that, something mythical, something legendary is going on here. So fuck off with your, do you know what I mean? With your over-analysis of how someone can be too skilled. Like, literally, it's a Chosen One story. That, to some degree, that's the fucking point.
Yeah, agreed. And I think what's really interesting with the Korra one, and you're talking about the spiritual side, and I think that's a really, really good thing. I think you picked up on something really interesting there. Because what that kind of implies, if it is, as I've always sort of seen it, that she's just was able to pick up, the physical bending itself really early on for many of the more forceful elements, fire, earth and water, but hasn't managed to do airbending yet, and he's also not connected to her spiritual side. That kind of implies something very interesting about Aang, because Aang was extremely spiritual as an avatar, and you just assumed, well, all the avatars are that spiritual. But what I think this leads you to believe, potentially, is Aang's spiritual side came from his monk training, came from his airbending training specifically. Yeah. And that airbending is one of the more spiritually connected elements, and the Air Nation specifically. And it's clear Tenzin is trying to, and we'll come to Tenzin specifically in a second, but I think it's clear Tenzin is trying. He's got Air Temple Island, which is presumably, the house that Aang built, as it were, but he's living there with his airbending family, and, they wear traditional airbending garb, and they have a sky bison. It's clear that Aang did his best to keep the Air Nation alive through his family. And the idea that Korra is going to train with Tenzin is maybe as much about connecting to her spiritual side as it is about learning airbending, and it's just very interesting to see the contrast between Korra and Aang. Korra being very sort of straightforward, like practical, able to do the element bending, but just not really seeing the world beyond that. By the time Aang was 12, he was connecting to the spirit world, and I do remember that early episode of Last Airbender where he goes to that village that are being haunted by a spirit, and he goes into the spirit world and actually disassociates from his, not dissociates, sort of comes out of his body and goes and talks to the spirit and all that stuff, and he was doing that at the age of 12, and here Korra is clearly older than Aang was. I don't know exactly how old Korra is supposed to be here. I assume she's got to be towards sort of 16, 17, I'd imagine. You all right there, buddy?
That was my assumption, yeah. Yeah, sorry, I did step away from the mic for that last cough, and I will step away now to try and clear my throat, but I've got a cold and a slight coughing fit, which I apologise to listeners for.
You do that, Chris, and I'll aim a question at you regarding that then. So having a more mature avatar, I think, was a really smart decision. Leaving her with just one thing to sort of learn. She's 17. She's 17 in book 1. So there you go. Having a more mature avatar is clever for me in a couple of ways. One, by having her grow up over the lead of Last Airbender was 12 when the show started, and presumably 14 when the show finished. Oh no, only a year passed, didn't it? So 13 heading to 14 maybe when the show finished. Several years later, the fans of the show that had grown up watching Aang were now older. This is that. Oh, I've done it early, Chris. This is that Harry Potter thing of as the Harry and the gang got older across the books, the audience grew up with them. So if you were that age, you grew up with Harry Potter quite literally. And I think there's a little bit of that gone on here with Korra. Making her an older avatar has made also for a different tone and vibe, and I think that's a really smart choice. But I was wondering how you felt about that.
Yeah, honestly, anything. I was really, and again, I'm biased here because of how much of a surprise it was, but anything that separated it and made it feel different to Avatar, I really enjoyed. And I think her age and her being older is a big part of that. Like, alongside, like I say, the fact that it isn't about her necessarily finding a gang and going off on adventures. I really liked all of that. And I think I hadn't thought of it, again, just, in that, I wasn't analysing it particularly deeply until this moment. I hadn't thought of, they've aged the character, the central character, in the way they've the audience have potentially grown. Mm-hmm. But I think that's genius. I think that's very, very clever. And I look forward to a third series set in the world where, the Avatar is in their sort of 30s, dealing with presumably the internet. So yeah.
I agreed with something you said earlier as well, and we didn't get a chance to explore it properly. The lack of the character in this episode. This is very much a "Here's the World" episode. We don't.
Yes, yeah.
A criticism you could aim at this first episode as a standalone piece of media is we don't really get to learn a huge amount about the characters. We get a little bit of Korra. Korra clearly naive, fish out of water.
I don't know, dude. I think you could argue we learn more about Tenzin than we do Korra, honestly.
Really? Interesting. Let's talk about that then. How are you feeling about that?
Because we know who is... Okay, so we know her goal, which is to learn airbending. Mm-hmm. We know his goal, which is to fix Republic City. Right. We know some of the stuff he's seemingly struggling with, the balance of, his father's legacy versus what's right. We know who he's coming up against, Toph's daughter, and the general world and the issues in Republic City. So we know what his challenges are. Mm-hmm. We know who his family is. We know who he would want to protect in a crisis.
Yeah.
We've seen hints of his relationship with his family. We've seen hints of his wife being a little bit fed up of birthing airbenders. We've seen,
which is one of my favourite gags in the episode, to be honest with you. I just want one non-bender. Just give me one. I want one kid to not immediately start, blasting my face with air.
Yeah, we could draw a family tree where we name his brothers and sisters, and I love that one of the children was named after Booby. That was Booby. Sorry.
I know we don't normally do spoilers on this, but it's 4 seasons. I think you can probably guess this. We will at some point meet the siblings.
Yeah, which I'm thrilled about. I'm really excited about.
Yes.
So I just feel like it's his voice that opens the show. And I'm not necessarily criticizing. It's the first 23-minute episode. I'm not saying this show about a young woman has focused more on a young man. I don't think they've focused more on Tenzin in this episode. I just think by proxy of the things that they've done and the fact that he's related to Aang, I feel like I've come out of this episode knowing more about his situation and challenges and potential challenges than I have Korra, whose challenge is essentially learning one of the elements, which is one thing I probably would have predicted.
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting about Korra is Korra doesn't feel particularly... Because she's been put in a bubble, there's something really interesting about what they do with Korra. Choosing to have her basically be isolated for her whole life. Like, the White Lotus is kind of fucked up, in my opinion here. Previous avatars to Aang, not including Aang had a very special set of circumstances, but previous avatars to Aang got to go travel the world and learn the elements. Korra didn't have that luxury. Korra was wrapped in bubble wrap, taken to a compound, it seems, where she had to ask permission to go for a ride on her polar bear dog, I think. Naga. She's been very isolated, and that's become very clear because she's got a really simplistic view of the world. And that's one of the really interesting things they do with her in this episode is that obviously stepping outside of that bubble for the first time, she's realizing she's actually understanding the weight maybe of who she is. Like, she's like, oh, I'm the Avatar. I'm the one who can do all the bending. But actually, she's come out now and seen how broken Republic City is, and is like, crap, maybe I'm responsible. Maybe I've got to do... Maybe this is my job to do something about this. And while the episode doesn't exactly go into depth about it, I do think showing her naivety, coming in, trying to take out the triads, taking food from Central Park by fishing in it. Like, it's not called Central Park, but you know what I mean. It's Central Park. All of that naivety does do a lot to characterize Korra. And actually, what it does is it characterizes her as someone who does not yet understand the weight of her position. Aang had nothing but understanding of the weight of his position. In fact, it's what drove him to run away. He didn't want to be the Avatar because he knew what that meant. Korra is literally the opposite of that. She's no comprehension. She's like, oh, I'm that cool one that can do all the different bendings. And that's it. She doesn't seem to understand anything beyond that at all. She's just like, yeah, I want to learn how to airbend. That's the last one. Let's go do that. Like, she doesn't seem to be thinking about what that means beyond that. And I think one of the things that this show will do is bring Korra to the realization that she's really important to the world's progress as well. People look to her, look to the Avatar to help create balance and move things forward and protect people, and and where does that fit into a world that's moving this fast forward as well? Like, I don't know. It's really interesting.
I know you didn't mean that as a counter, but actually that's quite a good counter to my point about it feeling like I know more about Tenzin, because you're right. Actually, the pieces of what Korra's journey will be are very much there and embedded within it.
Right? Yeah. No, I didn't mean it as a counter, but it was just naturally thinking of, because she is quite an interesting character. I know let's not pretend it isn't partly as well, because some people out there are just sexist. But this whole Mary Sue thing, they can just do it all and they're great or whatever. Like, it always pisses me off as an argument. We talked about it earlier when you talked about Rey, and it drives me mad with Korra as well, because I think Korra is actually a particularly interesting. She's an interesting character, and I know some people think she's a little bit bland. That's a criticism the show sometimes gets. I don't agree. I think she's different to Aang. That doesn't make her boring, in my opinion.
I think
she has interesting struggles.
I think she should be different to Aang as well. I get the feeling this show is one of those things where, even if, where for some people, it doesn't live up to Avatar, but there will be people out there where this show means more to them than Avatar. Where this show, and I think,
sure.
I
know someone who feels that way.
Yeah, and without making bold decisions like this, that doesn't happen. It's not going to be someone's strawberry cheesecake ice cream unless you do that. It's just going to be everyone's vanilla ice cream, which isn't really as fun. Do you know what I mean? Even though, it's not going to be a bad ice cream, pistachio for some. I've gone too far with the ice cream metaphor, Dan. But what I'm saying is, by doing something like this, I'd rather it be someone's favourite show than everyone's average show. Yeah. But to be someone's favourite show, it's going to be someone's least favourite show.
I think that's
Even
true.
That got a bit away from me.
No, I know. I 100% know what you mean. I think for this show to set itself aside, to not just be a sort of bland retelling of Avatar or a retreading of the content of Avatar, it has to take risks, and taking risks will lead to it being, something really strong and unique and stands on its own for some people, and will work less favorably for others. And I think that's the risk you take when you make this choice. But I think this is the big swing. It might miss for some people, it might hit for some people, but it is undoubtedly a big swing. And I really respect the show for that. And like I said before, jokingly partly, but its biggest crime really is just not being Last Airbender. And it continues to get stick for that. Trust me, it does have flaws. It is less perfect than Avatar. It's got some character and structural stuff that we'll talk about as the show goes on, but 52 episodes of the show there's some really, really good stuff in here, and I do feel like it gets unfairly dismissed often. So I'm really excited to go on this sort of this journey specifically, and I think this episode is a really, really strong setup. And I remember when I first watched this episode, even though I knew what was coming, and I knew that in terms of I knew what it was going to be about, and how much time had passed, and that we wouldn't have many characters from the original series, and all that stuff. Because, of course, for the next Avatar to be born, the previous one has to have died. So I knew we weren't getting, any Aang, which probably...
Well, yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah, that's my naivety, actually, not remembering that in terms of, like, oh, yeah, Aang's dead.
Yeah, Aang has to be dead or there isn't a new Avatar, But, so knowing that, going into it... Because I guess, one thing this show could have been is this show could have been a prequel. This, from the perspective of someone, if they just hear that there's another show set in the world called Legend of Korra, you go, well, is Korra maybe like a really ancient Avatar? Or, the Avatar, 3 or 4 Avatars, it has to be like 6 or 7 Avatars before Aang. We're going back a few, like 400-500 years or something.
Yeah,
to another.
I think the problem there is, and let's do it again in terms of of taking a shot. The problem there, it's your Fantastic Beast problem. The world of Avatar Series 1 set up this notion of this is the biggest battle the world's ever seen. And, there's been stuff in the past, involving Aang's former... I can't remember the names, but the former Fire Master... No, the current Fire Master...
Yeah, so Roku, his previous Avatar, and then
yes.
Kyoshi, the previous Earthbending Avatar.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
But we saw that. We've seen those stories in the same way that we've seen... Yes. The Marauders map, and if the Marauders gang, we know what their story is, and I think the problem is if you try and go, okay, well we're going to go back further, and this is the ultimate battle, you get that Fantastic Beast thing of, well, it's not, this isn't, Harry v Voldemort, is it? And we know the conclusion to this. So I think that's the problem with going backwards for 4 seasons of television. I think you can go backwards for a movie, you can go backwards for a special, you can go backwards for a flashback episode. But I think the challenge with making people invest, again, as has arguably been seen with the Fantastic Beasts movies and the fact that, the box office returns have diminished, I think the problem is making people... It is always difficult to make people... No matter how many times people try it and no matter what people say, it is always difficult to make people invest in a story where they know the conclusion. And you can't even throw... Because obviously one of the biggest shows of this year has been House of the Dragon. We don't really know the conclusion to that prequel because what they've done is a very clever prequel thing of making it about specific characters and, not great world-ending stuff. Because the problem with making it world-ending stuff is if it's a prequel, we know the world didn't end.
Right. And what's really funny about House of Dragon is that apparently, if you rewatch Game of Thrones, there's a point when Joffrey tells the story and gives away its ending.
Oh, really? Wow.
Because that was all built into the world. Yeah. So if someone said I got really annoyed because I was watching House of Dragon, it inspired me to go back and watch Game of Thrones. And Game of Thrones spoils the ending of House of Dragon and where it goes. Oh, wow. And I'll tell you what they have done with House of Dragon that's really clever. Very quickly, and I'll try and make it as quick as possible. They are treating the books like books written about it by historians, so they don't have all the details right. So certain situations where, let's say, a character was thought to be dead, it's because that's what historians have written down. And there's a reason historians would think that, but actually something else happened. And I think...
Yeah, history's... What's the phrase? History's written by the victorious.
Yeah, right. Yeah, history's written by the victors. So the notion that, like, the story as they know it in Game of Thrones isn't quite exactly what happened. So that gives them a little bit of wiggle room to do some surprises. And I think that's been very clever. But yes, it's not always executed that well. And often prequels are not problematic, but, aren't as interesting if you don't handle it very carefully. Although, these particular writers, Brian Mikey, I think, I would trust them to do that in an interesting way, to be honest. But yeah, I definitely foresee that as being a potential issue. So we talked about, the massive industrialization. How did we feel about cars being in the world of Korra? The Sotomobile, as they called it. A lot of people felt weird about that. That was a big, oh, really? Cars? How did you feel about that? Or did that not really bother you?
No, it didn't really bother me. I mean, we've essentially had Zeppelins, haven't we? So
it's true. That's true. Oh, and tanks. Yeah, we had tanks. They were Fire Nation tanks. Yeah. But that's fair. How do we feel about this depiction of Katara? Because obviously this is Katara, in her twilight years, sort of the wise old lady of that particular water tribe. How did you feel?
I think it makes sense. I mean, how disappointing would it be to have a wise old lady in the water tribe in this year that wasn't Katara? So I think it makes sense. Sure. I think I would have liked to have explored the pain of Katara a bit more. Like, I would have liked to explore the grief and the loss and get more details about all of that stuff. But one, I assume it's coming, and two, you don't really want to bog down the first episode of a show that's meant to establish a new show with that kind of thing.
And if Korra is 17 years old, that means Aang died nearly 20 years ago.
Yeah, so I want to find out more, but I think it's the right decision for the show to essentially have her be the wise elder. And it was fun. Again, I didn't know we were getting it. And funnily enough, when the first shot of her, I went, is that Katara? So I didn't even before she was named as Katara, which is a moment that they don't even particularly play as hard as they could have as well. So I
respect that. It could have been a real dramatic, like you hear a voice say, now, Korra, or whatever, and you see feet, and the camera pulls up, and it's like, it's like, they could have really egged that and made it like they could have milked that.
I think that was a really great decision not to do that. So I thought, she was the wise elder, and it was exciting to see her. All of those nods were exciting. Tenzin being his son, and knowing that we're getting more time with him was exciting. I want to find out more about Toph's daughter for sure. That was a nice surprise as well.
Yes, Lin Beifong.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think the Lin stuff is that they imply Toph started the police force.
Yeah, and certainly imply that, because obviously, it's easy to forget, and I suppose this is where watching a recap was handy. Metal bending was a unique thing that Toph could do. Like, there was logic in there that meant other earthbenders could do it, but Toph was the first to do it.
Yes.
And the notion that since Toph, metal bending has kind of become something that a police force can use to police people, and has sort of become this bigger thing is interesting, and again, kind of logical.
Yeah, very logical, but also really ties Tenzin and Lin together. Tenzin living in the shadow of a father that was not only the Avatar, but was the last vestiges of a race of the airbending tribe, of the culture. So Aang will have passed that on to Tenzin. And it's Tenzin's responsibility to keep that alive. That's a lot. But then you've got Lin, whose mother was the only vestige of metal bending that passed that on, and that has spread. But she's living in that shadow. It seems like Toph was a big part of Republic City and its early law and order. There's a statue of Toph outside the police station. The implication being she was a part of that. Both figures living heavily in the shadows of their parents, and yet butting heads, as you so pointed out, which is, I think, that's clever. That's very clever. I think,
and really thrilling that, like, this show's version of us getting hints about and the story of Roku and Iroh, and the Fire Lord. The notion that this show's version of that involves characters we already know and love from Avatar is very exciting. It's very logical, but it's incredibly in terms of a creative route to go down. But it's very exciting for that reason, I feel.
Has to be handled carefully and sparingly, but yes, 100%. How did we feel about the Zuko's mother joke, which I love as a joke, but I could see this bothering someone. So if anyone doesn't remember, Jinora, one of Tenzin's kids, is like, Katara, tell us what happened with Zuko's mother. I've been reading about your old adventures. She's like, oh, that's an amazing story. And then one of the other kids interrupts with like, can you do this? Or like some other innocuous question. How did you feel about the show making a gag out of essentially a missing plot element of the original series?
I loved it, but
Right.
if at the point of airing the comics hadn't come out, and obviously I know
a
that
great
there's a
question.
comic book series, and I also know that we're potentially getting 4 movies. Is it 4, 3 movies, whatever it is?
Yep.
That potentially also deal with that. So it didn't bother me because it came across as a joke, not at my expense. If no, obviously that stuff wasn't announced at that point, and if the comic books weren't
I'm checking
out,
that now. Bear with me. You
then
carry on, but I'm checking.
I can understand why people watching would have been annoyed because it slightly feels like a joke at their expense in that scenario.
Original air date March 24th, 2012. The comic came out March 2013, 1 year later. Oh no!
So there you go. So I can understand. It's a great joke. I love it.
Yeah.
But I can understand why someone not in my position of I could go and explore that story if I wanted to, and potentially it's going to be the premise of the films.
Yes, the films might cover it. That's true.
Yeah, it doesn't. I just think it's a funny joke. If I'm in that position, if I'm watching this there and then, I get why that might be annoying.
Oh, that's good.
It's like because Red Dwarf have done it. Red Dwarf ends on a big cliffhanger in series 8. The show returns, and then they've done, I think, once or twice. They've certainly done it once, where they've gone, "Hey, it's like that time when," and then just been cut off.
Right.
So and that frustrates people. I think it's one of those things that you can kind of choose how annoyed you get about it, but I can understand especially if the comic books weren't like announced and out. I can understand why people didn't like that.
Yeah, I would agree. So I guess 2 last quick things, then I'm happy to move on to. There's not much trivia. There's like 4 pieces of trivia, but we'll do a couple last quick notes, and then we'll do overall thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up. But in terms of characterization, we talked about the weight that we understand is on Lin Beifong. Toph's daughter, just from context. In terms of how she was actually presented in the episode, how did you feel she came across? What do you feel like you got from her character and her general tone?
She came across as someone who's trying to do what they think is the right thing, which I think is, always makes for a great antagonist. And obviously she's not the main antagonist. That's, Mask Man at the end, whoever he is.
That's my next question. Any theories you might have about him, but we'll come to that in a sec.
Oh no, I got no theories. Just person in a mask, innit? I don't even know if they're male, female, etc. Although actually they had quite a male voice, didn't they? Yeah, so they're male.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think it makes for a great antagonist. Someone who has a legacy of being a hero, but is fighting against someone else who has the same thing. But I definitely got the vibe that she believes that once we explore her angle more, we'll understand it. We'll see where she's coming from. I don't think she's going to be a villain. I think she's going to be someone that clashes with our heroes, and I think that's exciting.
Yeah, and also I think slightly prone to maybe little bouts of like her temper getting the better of her. Like when Korra does her childish me as she's leaving, Lin responds, which I think is the worst part, is that Lin's like back at Korra, which is really funny and tells us something about Lin. I think that Lin is also, she will stoop to Korra's level. She will stoop to that of a 17-year-old.
She's Toph's daughter, isn't she?
She really is. Yeah. So, absolutely agree.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I like her. I like the idea as well that she does fit an archetype, but it's a good one, like the no-nonsense cop sort of figure. And also, in a lot of ways, she's right. The damage Korra does way outstrips the damage the Triads would have done.
Yeah, for sure.
She's not. That's what's great about the way they structure this. Is like Lynn is correct. Like Korra acted very irresponsibly. You know, she was trying to do the right thing. Her intentions were good, but her actions were bad. Like she crashed that car into a shop just to stop them from getting away. Someone could have been in that shop. Like
yeah.
Very irresponsible. So yeah, I enjoy that. Let's quickly talk about Amon then. So there is the episode. I'll tell you, the episode does contain a pretty big hint as to who and where he's from. So the character is seen at the end. Someone says that the Avatar's in town, and he sort of basically says we'll have to accelerate our plans. But you do see him at an earlier point in the episode, Chris. Would you like me to tell you where?
Yeah, man, go for it.
So when Korra is listening to the guy whipping up anti-bending sentiment, there is a big poster behind him with that same mask on it.
Okay.
So you can infer
he's Trump.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So I thought you might enjoy that.
Okay, that is a nice nod. And I like that, you know, and you hinted, I think, early on, or at some point you hinted about how it's an interesting show to watch in a modern context. And, you know, all joking aside, it is. You know, that's... And I suppose, you know, that's also historical, isn't it? Like, people conspiring to make other people fight against each other. Like, that's, you know, that's incredibly modern, but also incredibly historic. So just a tragic theme of, you know, despite all the historical evidence, people not... Yeah, anyway. Let's not get on a depressing rant, Dan. It's Christmas. But my point...
It's not Christmas for our listeners, Chris. It's February.
Yeah.
Merry February, everyone.
Happy Valentine's Day, guys. So I think that is going to be interesting and play with historical and modern ideas that are going to feel tragically relevant, I think.
Yes. Agreed. Shall we move on to the triv, Chris?
Yeah, let's triv it up!
I'm going to give you some trivia. So... this episode, together with A Leaf in the Wind, shockingly, Chris, had the highest viewership of the entire book one. Yeah, not surprising. I suspect it's one of those things, a lot of hype around this show. Won't have been for everyone, so some of those people will have dropped off. Though, its first episode was always going to be its peak, even if it then had steady or really good ratings following that. This episode was originally supposed to feature a fight between Amon and Korra in the initial part of the story. Actually, it doesn't say that here. It just says a fight with Amon in the initial part of the story. On the network's advice, the scene was later cut to slow the episode's pacing and provide the audience more time to be introduced to the new setting and characters. Now, that's an interesting thing to see that came from the network. A network note that it's good and sensible and works.
Yeah. But, you know, it has been known, I guess.
Yeah. Surprising. Yeah, you know what? Maybe there are some people that work at networks that aren't complete fucking idiots. So cool.
Maybe.
During the Harry Potter
movies,
who knew
those
Radcliffe
people
went through 160 pairs of glasses, Chris.
Fuck you. Like you've not, because literally when we started trivia, I was like, oh, the good thing here is Dan's already forgotten to do that Harry Potter joke in multiple episodes of Rewind Reviews.
Chris, I specifically didn't do it for the last few to lull you into a false sense of security.
Well,
so I tell you, honestly, do it here and surprise you. If anyone doesn't know, I've been throwing that piece of trivia that Daniel Radcliffe went through 160 pairs of glasses into every podcast we've done for the last, I don't know, 20-odd episodes, 30-odd episodes.
What's upsetting about that is me falling for it, because and I mean this sincerely, Dan. If I'm listing, like, and obviously not taking into account, big world things like, poverty and violence and all of that stuff. If I'm listing, take all that stuff out. If I'm listing my top 10 things that, wind me up and upset me as a person, you getting to be smug is on that list.
I literally said to Nadia last night, I'm so excited about this podcast recording because I've made Chris think I've forgotten the Harry Potter glasses thing.
Ugh. Or you actually forgotten and you've twisted it into a clever.
No. I think I did. I think there was one I did forget somewhere in the middle of the last Rewind Reviews run, but the last couple
There was one
because
if memory serves, you reacted either the next week or on that episode. Oh fuck, I forgot to do that.
Yeah, there was definitely one I forgot, but the last couple was very much intentional.
Oh, that is incredibly upsetting.
So yeah, enjoy and expect to hear all about how many pairs of glasses Daniel Radcliffe went through on the Harry Potter movies for the rest of this series of Korra.
Oh, God.
The triple threats attacked Korra in the order.
But the thing, it's not even a real fact. You don't even know how many pairs of glasses he went through.
That was in the triv, Chris.
Oh, was it? Is it an actual piece of triv that you? Right. Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah, it started as a real piece of triv. And then I just, because remember, if you remember rightly, during the Harry Potter films, because the trivia came up in Philosopher's Stone, but it says during the Harry Potter movies, implying it's true through all of them.
Right.
So originally I was, if you remember, Chris, originally I was testing if you were listening by doing it every week. To see how long it would take you to notice.
Which I proved I was.
Yeah, third or fourth episode, yeah.
No, but that's because it took me a while to be like, I swear he said that last week. Oh, I'm probably imagining it. I'll forget it. I mean, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong, Dan. I fully admit, sometimes I don't listen to the trick. So, yeah.
Last piece of triv. Two pieces of triv. Sorry. The triple threats attacked Korra in the episode in the Avatar cycle. With obviously air removed because there aren't any airbenders. So it was water, earth, and fire in that order, which is the Avatar cycle.
Nice.
True story. The final piece of trivia, Chris, is regarding. So for those who don't actually, because we don't normally do this segment on Korra, but we have a segment on Rewind Reviews called Cars Exist, where I say, I say it's time for Cars Exist, and Chris goes, meow, which is my favourite thing.
Yeah. You do it. You started doing it as well, haven't you? You make a little noise.
Yeah, sometimes I get into it. Yeah, I have fun with it. I like it. I like the little car noise. But we're going to be adjusting it, Chris, because in the world of Korra, they're not called cars. So welcome to my new segment. Sotomobiles exist.
They get the same noise.
Yeah, it's a good noise. So the Sotomobile is what they call a car.
Unless a clear alternative noise identifies itself within the show, in which case I will adjust.
Sure. That makes sense. Sotomobiles are what they seem to call cars in this world, which is very reminiscent of, like, you know, in the early days of cars, like obviously the Ford was the car, you know, in a lot of ways because it was one of the only real. And also, the big production line was basically invented by Ford, and like that's kind of the implication here is that part of this industrial revolution is the company that's making these automobiles. But very specifically, the standard design of a Sotomobile, like the base model that you see a lot in this episode, is heavily resembling the Ford Model T, which is one of the first mass-produced automobiles. So, yeah, Sotomobiles exist. There we go.
No.
So, thanks everyone for listening. We're gonna leave it there, but a few bits of admin, I guess. You can contact us in many, many ways, one of which is by emailing mail@nothingbutstatic.co.uk. You can also head over to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/nothingbutstaticuk, where you can leave comments on the videos for these very podcasts. So if you've got something to say about this very specific episode, find it on our YouTube and put the comment down there. We don't really do Twitter anymore, but you can also contact us through the Patreon, patreon.com/nothingbutstatic, where you can also sign up for as little as $1 a month and hear next week's episode right now. So if you're not already on the Patreon and you're listening to this on Spotify or iTunes or any of those podcasting apps, you're welcome to go over to the Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you get access to our Discord and episodes 1 week early, and hopefully a little bit later this year, or now we're in the new year, hopefully very soon, a short little bonus podcast that we talked about doing last year. We haven't had a chance to actually record yet, but that'll be quite fun when we get around to it.
Can I actually, and this will be very late, but can I give a shout out, because I still have Twitter, whilst I don't use it. In fact, I haven't used Twitter for years, in fact, but I still have Twitter. So you might not have seen, Dan, we got a tweet. Hold on, let me find it, because this is mind-blowing, and hopefully my phone being near the mic isn't affecting signal, but bear with me 1 second.
Do it. Shall I finish doing the stuff while you're...
Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah. So the other thing you can do to support us is just obviously tell a friend or keep listening yourself. That also supports us. Or head over to the podcast app that you do listen to us on and let it know you enjoy the podcast by liking, reviewing, starring, hearting, whatever that is. That tells that app you enjoyed the podcast, and it will be more likely to share it with others through the algorithm TM. Also, go support Raphodraws, Rapho Draws, who... is an artist who supplied us with that key piece of art you always see on this podcast, which is Appa and the original gang in the sunset. There's two versions of it. There's sunset, there's moonlight, and you can get that kind of art and many of Rapho's amazing work on all sorts of stuff. There's like a Redbubble account, and there's comics and just tons of really cool art. So support Raphodraws. Launchlinks.io/u/Raphodraws will take you to a page with links to like the Tumblr, the Twitter, the Redbubble, the YouTube, all that stuff. Or you can go to instagram.com/Raphodraws. Again, it's RAPHO draws. Draws as in DROWS. So yeah, that's how to support. Have you found what you're looking for, Chris?
Yes,
I'm going to guess that's a no.
No, I have. So, and this is their only tweet, but it's very specific. So maybe they joined to message us this. I don't know. But a Twitter user called Ryan has tweeted, "Thanks, Analysing Avatar, for being my top podcast on Spotify this year. I loved all 4,362 minutes of it. Hashtag Spotify Wrapped," and then there's a link, and then they've tagged us and said, "You all got me through some tough times listening to Rewind reviews now. Keep it up, guys." So yeah, just a shout out to them. Like I say, it's their only tweet, but it feels very specific to, suggest it's most likely a real person. In which case, Ryan, thanks for listening. The fact that you've listened to 4,000 hours of us talking this year on this podcast is phenomenal. So yeah, thank you very much.
That's incredible. Yeah, we always get every year. I'm always surprised that we're on anyone's Spotify Unwrapped. Like it's, and it shouldn't surprise me. I see the stats. I know we have, potentially across the podcast with thousands of listeners across them, which is, it always surprises my brain. But so it makes sense that for some people, we're gonna be in their top. Now, I've got to assume the reason that happens is that people who don't use Spotify for much else. 'Cause otherwise, why would we be anywhere near the top? But that's still very good.
Over 4,000 hours. The thing that's incredible about that stat is that's not listening to. That's like listening to it more than once.
Is it? So it's 4,000. What's that? 4,300.
Oh well, hold on. Let me check whether it was hours or minutes.
I think that's minutes. Because hours would be ridiculous. Because that would be listening to it hundreds of. Because if it was hours, it would be listening to it hundreds of times.
Yeah, sorry, no, it is minutes. Which, to be fair, then in terms of hours, I think is
72 hours.
72 hours, yeah. So
I just did the math. So yeah, 72.7 hours. Which, when you consider we did 60 episodes, many of which were about an hour and 15 minutes, and some of which were about an hour. That's the whole thing. That's incredible.
Still awesome. It's still fantastic. Yeah, because it's been, we've released it. The fact that, you've listened to the whole thing in a year is great, and thank you for your kind words about getting you through some stuff, and thank you to everyone who reaches out and says stuff like that. But yeah,
and thank you to everyone who followed us through to Rewind Reviews as well.
Yes, yeah, which this user's done. So thank you, Ryan.
Mm-hmm. Massive thumbs up. And also, obviously, everyone can check out Nothing But Static, our other podcast where we talk about TV. We don't spoil the shows we review on that, so if you're concerned about that, don't worry. We just and if we ever do, we highlight it very heavily, but it doesn't happen, generally speaking. So you're safe to listen. If there's a show we're talking about that you've not seen yet, we actually just use it as a basis for like an overall conversation, and then whether we recommend the show or not. So actually, it can be a good way. Some people have said they use it as a way to sort of like to help them gauge if a show that they're tempted by is worth checking out. Not just if we're giving it a recommend or not recommend, but the stuff specifically we're saying about it. So if we're saying that we think it's got some really good performing in it, there's some really good actors, but the story's not very good, that might suit somebody that wants to watch a show that's particularly, got really engaging performances, and don't mind the storytelling being a little bit shallow, or we might say a show has some really good writing, but the production lets it down. So people have said that it's helped them figure out what shows to give time to in a world where there are far too many shows. That's some people have said that's very helpful, and I think that's very sweet when people say stuff like that. I always really like that, to hear that people find shows, discover shows based on our recommendations. That's always lovely.
Means the world.
So that's everything for this week. Thank you guys for sticking with us. We're at the start of a brand new journey now, and a very exciting one. And based on this episode, I can't wait to explore the world of Korra again. It's been a couple of years for me, I think, since I've rewatched this. I think the pandemic, 2020 maybe was the last time I watched this show, which sounds like not that long ago, but I mean it's 2023 now, so it's 3 years since I've watched this show. It's gonna be really interesting to come back to it. So thanks everyone for listening. I've been Dan Doolan.
I've been Chris Billingham.
And that's been everything for this week. We'll see you next week when we sit down to watch A Leaf in the Wind.